I want to welcome everybody to the McLennan County Community Race Relations Coalition panel on Asian American hate and discrimination. I'm your moderator and CRRC board member, Catherine Turner Pearson. Tonight, our panel is Dr. Jonathan Tran, religion professor at Baylor University, Jaja Chen, licensed clinical social worker and co-owner of Waco Chai, Kathy Chen, attorney with Cheng, Kathy Cheng, with attorney with Cheng and Associates, and former Democratic candidate for the Texas Supreme Court. And Sharyl, I forgot to ask you before we started the correct pronunciation of your name, but is it Loeung? Sharyl?
Pretty close, yeah, Loeung.
Loeung, okay. You are the coordinator for the Multicultural Affairs Department at Baylor University. And on behalf of the CRRC, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us tonight and share your experiences with us. The way we're going to work this discussion, I'm going to ask a few questions of the panel to get us started. And as we proceed this evening, if anyone in the audience has a question, please put the question into the chat, and then we will get to as many of those as possible. We plan to end tonight at 8 p.m. Central Time, sharp. So as soon as you think of your questions, get them in. And when I get an opening, I will try to ask those questions of everybody. A little bit about Asian hate and the history here. There has been a huge rise in Asian hate and discrimination in the United States. Hate speech leads to hate violence. So words do matter. And there's been a lot more hate speech that started all of this. Out of all of the United States, by March of this year, Texas ranked 4th in Asian hate incidences. There were 3,795 Asian hate related incidents from March of 2020 to February of 2021, and 103 of them were in Texas. But in Texas, 20% of the cases resulted in physical assault, which is the highest percentage in the United States. In fact, Asian hate crimes in the United States is up 149% in the last year. And people say these crimes don't happen here in the Waco area, but sadly they do. That is why we're here tonight, to shed a light on this rise in Asian hate and discrimination, because the first step in change is recognizing that the hate and discrimination happens in the first place. All right, so I'm going to start with our esteemed panel here. And so the first question, and I want each one of you to answer this, and we're going to go with you, Jonathan, to start with, is why did you say yes to being on this panel? And what is your cultural heritage background? Just real briefly, if you would.
Thank you. I decided to be on it because the coalition does great work, and it's great to be with y'all, and a real honor. And this is a really important moment, not simply for Asian Americans, but everyone living in this country. So my background is I'm Vietnamese American. I came here at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975 as a 2-year-old.
Wow. All right, Jaja.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jaja Chen, and I am a Taiwanese American. I'm actually a dual citizen of both Taiwan and the US. And I decided to say yes to this panel out of my value specifically for diversity, and that's personal value, but also a value of our company, Waco Chop. And it's something that when it comes to shedding light on racism and race-related concerns and even anti-Asian racism, that's a topic and an area that we have been trying to spotlight and even to bring more awareness in.
All right, thank you. Sharyl?
Yeah. I said yes because Dr. Stephen Reed asked me to, and he's been a mentor of mine, was a seminary professor of mine, and kindly passed me in his Lamentations Hebrew reading class that I never should have passed. But I actually said no at first because I didn't feel like I should be on this panel. I wanted to make sure that others had the opportunity because there are other leaders, Asian American leaders in town, and a lot of really powerful ones. And he just came back and kind of insisted. And so after talking with Jaja and Dr. Tran, just felt like that I had some experience with our youth here that would bring something to the table. And so I did agree. My last name comes from my husband. So he is Cambodian American and came over as a Cambodian refugee after the Khmer Rouge massacre. So
Thank you for that. Kathy. What is, for each one of you, what is one thing that you hope every person listens tonight goes away with? You know, what if there's one thing you want them to get from this panel tonight, what would that be? And I'm just going to stick to that same order for now, just because that's how you appear on my screen. So Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers that you reported, super important numbers in the beginning, about 3,800, just under 4,000 reported cases of anti-Asian American racism. One of the things that Stop AAP I Hate, the group that's been collecting the numbers, wants us to remember is that those are only the reported cases. In their most recent report, they said that's probably minuscule compared to the actual number out there. And there's interesting dynamics and painful realities within that the 2/3 of the reported cases have been Asian American women, that the elderly are attacked. So people who are vulnerable are increasingly made vulnerable by these realities. So what I would want people to know is that what's happening now is a significant spike, but even before the pandemic, Asian Americans rated the highest in reported incidences of racism in America on a regular basis. And so that this is not only consistent with what was happening to Asian Americans before the pandemic, but it's consistent with what's happening right before the pandemic, as well as largely the long history of Asian Americans. That Asian Americans have been here about 150, 170 years, and they've been scapegoated, and acts of racism, physical violence, lynching has been happening to them all the way through. And I think the others can speak for themselves, but this is very much a part of my story, experiencing racism since I was a little kid. I came to America at the end of 3 decades of wars with Asian people. The War of the Japanese in World War II, the Korean American War, and then the Vietnam War. And so seared on the American conscience was the idea that people like me were dangerous. And this followed 100 years before that of Chinese exclusion, Japanese internment, right? So these are kind of part and parcel with the Asian American experience.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Jaja.
Yes, I think for me, my hope is that each individual participating in today's panel and discussion would leave with a reaffirmed or affirmed commitment when it comes to doing the work of racial justice and anti-racism, and really starting to think through, what are simple ways to start to move in that direction, or even make commitments in the day-to-day life. I know May is the month of the AAPI Heritage Month, but I think it's important for us to really see that, our commitment to action and next steps in learning and growing is more than just a month. And so it's important to continue in our day-to-day learning and seeing, what are ways that we as individuals and in our community can start to continue working and learning and growing and being committed in this area.
Thank you very much. And Sharyl.
I would say, first of all, just to not buy the lie. If people would not buy the meek and mild lie, and part of that has to do with a perception of a particular presentation of leadership in culture that is the only acceptable form of leadership in culture. But part of that is wrapped up in what Dr. Tran was talking about, that because of so many years of violence, and that violence can be both verbal and emotional and psychological. We've seen economic violence against storefronts, all the way to what's, pieces of physical violence, that what that does, that chilling effect that creates, that is very different than being meek and mild. That's a generational trauma. And not to mention the wars beyond that, but also that there's such a robust history of activism amongst Asian Americans, and a history that's just not told. And that would be something that maybe we'll get into that a little bit later, that counter narrative of activism through the 50s and 60s and 70s. And that certainly shows us a very different story than what I think has been told.
All right, Kathy, what I had asked is if there was one thing that you hope that everybody goes away with tonight from tuning into this panel, what would be that one thing you hope they take away from this? What would that be for you?
Well, I hope that everyone takes away from this webinar is that no matter what ethnic group we are, when something happens, we as a community need to come together, because the only way we can do away with any hate crime against any community is to all come together. It's not just the Asian Americans come to the rescue of the Asian American hate crime group or some kind of unity event. It's not just the African Americans going to the Black Lives Matter event. All of us as community members and as diverse of a city and nation and country that we are, we need to band together in order to stop any type of hate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I kind of wanted to look at some of your takes on the Asian hate based on kind of what you do for a living, perhaps. So, Jonathan, as a religion professor at Baylor University, what have been your experiences recently as both a college professor, a person of faith, in terms of racism towards Asian Americans?
I began writing a book on Asian Americans and racism 3 years ago. I could not have nearly anticipated the political moment that we are in now. That is, this may be the most significant political moment in Asian American history, simply as a function of us mattering. People, literally 6 months ago, if you asked most Americans, do Asian Americans experience racism? The answer would probably be no. I think if the needle has moved, it at least has moved in the direction that people are no longer able to widely claim that Asian Americans don't suffer racism. The book does two things. I put it in the chat for folks. The book does two things. One, it tries to come to terms with the racism that Asian Americans experience and how to understand that racism in relationship to the racism, say, African Americans experience, Latinx communities, indigenous people. It therefore tries to give a broad enough concept and understanding of what racism is to make sense of all these different kinds of oppressions and other forms of violence. What I try to say is that racism isn't, as many of us tend to think it is, say, racist beliefs and attitudes about other people that sometimes get institutionalized. It rather works the other way. Racism is set into our structures and systems in a way that then facilitates certain beliefs to justify the inherent injustice of our society. So we live in a society of crushing poverty, injustice, inequality. What race does is it sits as a veneer of respectability on top of that to justify the system that we live in. It's a way of saying something like, well, why are Black and brown people in the poorest parts of Waco? Because they're Black and brown. It's something about them, something natural to them. That's how racism works. It justifies a system of domination and exploitation. That means if that's what racism is, then it's not as easy as searching out bad beliefs and trying to correct them. We then have to look at entire structures and systems and ask, why are they put together that way, right? A question we want to ask ourselves as a society is, if it's almost universally agreed in the United States at this point that racism is bad, even evil, why does it persist? What is it doing? Who is it benefiting? What is it producing? Those are much more difficult questions that will require us then to ask very difficult questions like, why do we use police and prisons, right, to try to correct for inequality, right? If you just look at it on the face of it, it's an absurd reality. We put police officers in horrible positions. We continue to not spend social services in ways that we need to. This is all situated under a larger veneer of race. That's really the first question I asked. The second question I asked, if Asian Americans have been, why does no one know that? Why do people continue to believe that Asian Americans don't experience racism, right? Think about the Atlanta shootings, how hard it was for the media to get its mind around the reality that this man targeted Asian businesses and Asian women. It took days for them to say, maybe this is not simply a sex crime. Maybe this is not simply an issue of, say, poverty, that there's race built into it. Why did it take so long? So what is it about our society that not only perpetuates racism against Asian Americans, but perpetually is unable to see that as racism? So what's happening in our perceptions of who Asian Americans are that we can't come to terms with what we're doing to them? So that's largely what the book tries to come to terms with. And so in answering your question, how do I come at it? I come at it as an academic trying to deal with these questions, largely as a biographical affair to try to make sense of my own life in this country.
Thank you very much for that. Jaja, you're a clinical social worker and a business owner in Waco. So what is your response to the incidences that have happened at Baylor, since we're following right on a Baylor professor? And I was wondering if you have had any incidences of racism with your company or as a business owner.
Yes, and so for the panelists who are not familiar, at Baylor, there was a student who was both verbally attacked and then physically assaulted and attacked near campus. And so that happened about a month ago, I believe, at this point. And that was to Asian American students specifically. So when I first heard about the attack through social media, actually, I think the first thought I had was just wondering about, how is the student doing and the impact of the trauma on the individual and also the individuals who were present with the individual, in that setting, because, I'm a trauma therapist, so I specialize in issues pertaining to trauma. And in this past year in particular, I'd say about the past 3 to 4 years, I've been doing a lot more racial trauma related work as a therapist, especially with people of color and individuals who have been impacted by racial trauma. And so I, as an Asian American therapist, had never planned to niche in Asian American therapy, but this past year I actually have experienced a lot more referrals and Asian American clients than I ever anticipated or planned to when it came to my career. And I know for a lot of other mental health professionals, they too have also seen a huge rise in increased needs, especially for mental health treatment for their Asian American, Asian immigrant clients in particular. And so that was my first thought. My response was just, how can we better support individuals who are impacted by these hate crimes, and the importance of even raising awareness for how, even if someone didn't personally experience hate crimes against themselves or their friend, that just hearing about the news or, witnessing or even just hearing about it from someone else can actually create post-traumatic stress response within your nervous system, in your body, even if you yourself did not experience the hate crime or even the racism, right? Especially for people of color, with the increase of social media exposure, videos, news, watching or listening to this content can actually lead to increased mental health responses or even just the nervous system responses. So I think it's very important for us as a community and as a society to really talk about, right, even as we're reporting the news, like to not be, how do I put it, in the sense of not be continuing to, just share Asian trauma or Black trauma or whatever person of color's trauma, through social media with the very specific content that I think it's important for us to raise awareness about that content, but then the more that is widely shared with all the details, it can actually lead to re-traumatization of individuals and can actually even lead to, the development of PTSD in folks who are watching those content. And I think, one of my own responses too, when I heard about the attack and even just hearing news about small business owners being attacked or their stores being vandalized in other cities in Texas, of course, personally, there's fear or even just concerns about, how will this impact our business or how will this impact our team members or our storefront. Thankfully, we ourselves haven't experienced any kind of physical or attacks in that regards. I've thought about, as we're pretty outspoken about racism, whether that would ever happen, to be honest. But we have experienced more microaggressions or even just words spoken to us, especially as we've been even more active on the news or just speaking out against racism. There's been, community leaders even who have made comments saying that, we're token Asians or making statements to really cause us to not speak up and to not share about the importance of raising awareness in this area. But, that is not going to stop us. And so I think what has really helped us personally, one, personally being in therapy ourselves, even as a therapist, to really surround ourselves with community, individuals, and folks who are walking out in anti-racism and seeking to be walking in the commitment, right, and of the value of diversity. That has been really huge. But, I think it's important too to make a note that even though we at Waco CHA didn't experience racism, even just last week, I talked to a business owner in town who experienced direct racism online through their DMs and even on their reviews on Google, because they were still committing to having masks be worn by guests in their business. And because of that, individuals actually left a lot of negative reviews on their page, and even called them un-American or just all sorts of very verbally harassment types of reviews and language regarding their establishment or who they are as a Asian immigrant or Asian small business owner. And that was here in Waco just last week. And so, as a community, Devin and I heard about that and started to ask for other folks and community members around us to help, write more positive reviews to kind of outweigh the algorithms. And so I think it's really important for us to kind of like what Kathy was saying earlier, to band together as a community to really speak against and to walk out in actions against any kind of hate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I did not know about that most recent incident, so thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to put, Sharyl, I'm going to put you on the spot. We had brought this up before. so you know it's coming. There have been several incidences of hate aimed at some of the younger people here in the Waco area, but one particular was with at least one Baylor student in recent days. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about what Baylor is doing in response and how Baylor is working to stop these type of incidences and any other reflections you have on it. We would be really welcome to hear that if you would.
Well, first I would say that, the biggest coverage has been on this latest incident because it was a physical attack, and there was a beautiful demonstration and march afterwards, and the news was there. And it's absolutely not tolerable. However, like we were speaking of earlier about physical and psychological and all these other types of violence beyond just physical violence. The violence started on Baylor's campus in December of 19, before COVID was even in the US. So students started complaining about people moving away from them in classes. If they coughed, they would make comments, or, as we get into January, February, pre-spring break of 2020, which is when Baylor shut down, parents start sending masks and they're trying to decide, do I wear it because my mom wants me to, but I don't want to be seen on campus. But more and more comments about go back to where you came from. Some of those students were experiencing a lot of anxiety about going anywhere or going anywhere alone. So even with Dr. Tran, we had a program planned for when we got back from spring break, and it was what's more contagious, I think was the title. What was more contagious than coronavirus, and it's xenophobia. And that was going to be the title of this lecture that we had planned for when we got back, and we didn't ever come back. But so the comments and those things were already starting, and there were conversations on campus in some of the diversity committees about it, but then everybody left and they weren't on campus. What then happened though is that some students did stay in Waco for their classes and their apartments and so forth. And we had students who were not safe. I won't say didn't feel safe, but were not safe even going to the grocery store. So we had reports of students who would go to Walmart and would get cornered in an aisle saying, you dog eater, get out of here, or HEB and here on Valley Mills, some students who were chased out, and it was similar slurs, and I won't even get into all of them, but it was multiple times, usually in the grocery stores, but to where I ended up putting a post up at one point and said, I need some of my white friends who would volunteer to go to the store. You could stand 6 feet away with some students because I need to know that they're going to eat and they're going to get food, because there were, and again, the secondary trauma that Jaja's talking about, it doesn't have to be your trauma. You stick that in a group chat and other people are just as scared to go to the store or to go out to eat. Waco is a hostile place. And this was, spring of 2020 into summer. Summer of 2020, we had a couple that was jogging, and they started on the Bear Trail, and when they left campus, they were followed in a truck, and slurs being said at them, and they weren't sure where to go or what to do because they were jogging. And when they called the police, they were told nothing happened. Nothing happened to them, so that they couldn't do anything. But they didn't know what do you do? And, obviously we now have a very famous case, Aubrey, that does not feel so good when we think about that. They called Baylor PD as well, and it was one of those kind of in-between jurisdictions. And so there were reports made for a long time about just not feeling safe, but there was also no easy way to say who did what or can't name the person, or I didn't see them, or it was dark. And so we never really got anywhere. Then there was this case, and I know that reports were made to Baylor PD, to Waco PD, to the Equity Office. I believe the Clery Act was initiated. I can't give you any updates. I don't know beyond that. But I do know that what part of why students were so upset, other than that an assault happened in a very close to campus proximity, is that they had been saying we aren't okay.
Wow. Thank you. I was taken by your comment that that the students feel that Waco was a hostile place. As a native Wacoan, that strikes me. I have one follow-up question for you, Sharyl, before we go to Kathy. Is this something you've ever seen before with the Baylor students?
Which part?
This hostility and hate towards the Asian students. Is this something that was always there and just is more emphasized now, or was it something that you really never had before? Is something, I just was wondering if this is really all that new, or was it just always simmering under the surface?
You know, it really just depends on where the fear is at the time. I mean, we've gone through things with our Muslim students before. We've gone through things with other students depending on what the political rhetoric is at the time. So it's hard to say specifically with this group, but I will say that whatever our political rhetoric is and wherever the most fear is in our nation tends to be who is going to receive the brunt of hate.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Kathy again. But before I do, Kathy, since your sound was messing up a bit, it would really be nice for those of us who really wanted to hear what you had to say if we could have you kind of reintroduce yourself to everybody, if you would. And then I have a question for you that as an attorney, you've heard everybody else making these comments. And I know that you've probably been thinking of responses to any of them. So I want to give you a chance to come back as an attorney with any of those responses. And then I wanted to know what experience you've had with your career as an attorney, kind of related to Asian hate and discrimination. But first, reintroduce yourself, if you would.
Okay, so my name is Kathy Cheng. I'm a private practitioner out of the greater Houston area. I'm a litigator. As Catherine Turner had mentioned, I formerly ran for a statewide position for the Texas Supreme Court. Now, as an attorney, in my experience, what I've seen is that due to the fact that the Asian community has a tendency to not be expressive of the treatment that they've been getting, and also not being involved a lot politically, there's a fear or misunderstanding with respect to a lot of the political judicial activities. So for example, in my field of legal practice, when clients go into a courtroom, clearly you could tell they're Asian clients if they're Asian. Depending on certain counties or certain courts, they're treated automatically with a different treatment. Let's say if they have no accent, judges are usually surprised because they expect the individual to speak in a certain way because they're Asian. In fact, for me personally, when I go into certain counties that I normally don't go into, judges, bailiffs, counsels in the courtroom are kind of startled, like, whoa, you don't have an accent. And that kind of takes me back a little bit, like, this is 2021 and I'm still encountering this. And so for clients of mine who are of Asian descent, having perfect speaking oratory ability, they're kind of frustrated with the fact that there's that implicit biasness towards individuals of color, to expect them to act a certain way, speak a certain way, look a certain way. And then on the other side, for clients who don't speak the language well, there's that frustration you see in certain elected officials. So as a result of that, I began, because I've been a political activist for a while, I began to tell my clients and my constituents around this area to say, we as Asian Americans need to get involved. It is not enough just to integrate into the communities, into this nation, into the state, and raise a family, have a wonderful job and everything. We need to integrate into the community by getting involved, getting to know your elected officials, voting to elect elected officials, so that there are individuals who look like us, so that you can understand what the process is like. And so that kind of led me into running for a political office, because the reality is the lack of numbers of community constituents in elected positions, the less we are to understand and overcoming that fear of, let's report something when something bad happens. And also, a lot of the panelists talk about the violence against the Asians. The reality is, sometimes it doesn't require violence. The mental torment sometimes is way more worse than the physical violence. And that has been endured tremendously by the Asian American communities across this nation. It's just that we don't report it, because why? We fear that if reported, there will be repercussions for reporting that. So hence has led to these years of misunderstanding that there really hasn't been any anti-Asian hate at all until the recent shooting with the Atlanta shooting. And just to show you how sensitive the other groups, other ethnic groups were with respect to the Atlanta shooting. So on the day of the shooting, I was actually on a vacation with my children, so I hadn't seen the news. But then all of a sudden that day, I started getting texts from my phone. People were asking, friends, colleagues, are you okay? Are you safe? And I didn't know why all of a sudden that came about. We have casual conversations and stuff, but it was such an astounding number of texts and emails. I didn't know why. Then I started noticing a pattern. A lot of these texts came from my African-American friends and colleagues, and I didn't understand why. So then one of the colleagues said, hey, I just want to make sure you're safe with the recent shooting. So then I turned on the news and I looked, and I was like, oh, so that's what happened. But it kind of goes to show you that even something like this, we have friends of other cultures, ethnic groups. When something like this happens, we don't have to tiptoe and sugarcoat things. Just get to the point and say, hey, we're here for you. Because one of my friends said, well, I didn't know how to bring it up. It's a sensitive subject. Yes, it is a sensitive subject. But the more we talk about it, the more we share, the more we come out and talk about this among, not just within our community, but across the board of all communities, that's when we desensitize this sensitivity of wanting to talk about it. The more we share, the more we will know, what does it feel like to be in your shoes? Because if I can understand, add that new lens to see what it's like from your perspective, then maybe I'll understand what I shouldn't or should not do to improve the situation.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Some interesting comments there. I want to remind the audience that we're getting some questions in, but if you have a question for any of the panelists, put them in the chat, and we're going to try to get to those before we're over. So I'm probably sure that more of you have questions than is what is pouring in, so feel free to throw those out there. Looking at some of the questions I have here, you were talking about that it's a lot of the worst part sometimes, Kathy, that you were talking about that this is sometimes the worst part isn't the physical, it's the mental. And so someone was actually commenting too on Sheryl's comment, or maybe that was Sheryl's comment. I'm trying to read what they said here on that. But I wanted to talk to Jaja about that because somewhere was both of y'all had kind of mentioned it. Jaja, since you're kind of a professional in that area, do you have any other comments to make about the fact that the mental could actually be worse than the physical sometimes? We were talking about the post-traumatic stress earlier. Is there any further comments you want to make on that? Because I think that's what they're looking for.
Okay, yeah. I think for the mental, it actually, so like emotional hate, or even just the verbal ways that people can speak, hatefully towards a culture or ethnic group or identity. I think it's actually I do resonate with what Kathy was saying, because it's even for the individual experiencing these experiences, it can lead them to be, to even doubt whether they even experienced it, right? It's like this idea of, I mean, I've done a lot of work with domestic violence victims and individuals who've gone through abusive relationships, right? And where there's an experience of like gaslighting or just doubting whether or not their experience is real, in the sense of whether they recall things accurately, or their memory, or even what they heard or said. And so for a lot of people who experience microaggressions, there can just be that sense of self-doubt regarding, okay, did I overhear, did I hear it accurately, or am I looking into it too much? The feeling of confusion regarding whether or not the experience was valid. And I know especially for individuals like international students or immigrants who are trying to acclimate to the culture, right? And just trying to do the best they can with learning the nuances of the culture and being away from home. Sometimes even they might wonder like, okay, maybe I didn't really understand what they're saying, or maybe I'm just making a big deal, or I need to just, not say anything. And so I think that's part of what has led to, the negative stereotypes towards Asians at times, of being silent or not speaking up regarding anti-Asian racism, hate crimes, or even just in general. It's important for us to see that it's a trauma response, right? I think Sharyl touched on that earlier, this idea of the generational trauma, or the ways our trauma response can keep us from speaking up at times, like freezing or not saying things when we maybe later on wished we could have spoken up. And so, yeah, a lot of people might not even realize that they're experiencing anxiety, depression, or even post-traumatic stress response because of going through the emotional impacts, right? And because you can't always just point back to, oh, okay, there was this physical attack that's a lot more clearly defined as a violence. And so then people might not even realize that they're experiencing a trauma response, right? And so then it could be a lot harder for them to even get help or support, or to even recognize that how they've been feeling is actually a trauma response.
I know, Kathy, you had brought up children, and someone had wanted to know, and I don't know, to be honest, if everybody has children and who does and who doesn't. So any of y'all, we'll start with Kathy, since she brought up children, and just to make any further comments, but then after that, I'm going to let any of y'all who might want to answer this question. Someone wanted to know, they had said, they had asked earlier, have any of y'all experienced any of this racism, which some of you have commented about your experiences, some haven't. Feel free to do that, but they mainly want to know if you have children, are your children experiencing any of the racism, and how is that affecting them? And I'll go to Kathy, and then just whoever, the other three of you want to go next, go right ahead, since Kathy, you brought up children first.
So I have three wonderful children. I have a 12-year-old daughter, a 6-year-old son, and a 5-year-old son. All of them are attending school. With the rise in hate crime, especially post-COVID, my daughter actually talks to me about this. The other two, they're kind of young. They don't see the differences between the kids in their age group. Really don't see differences in color or just gender mainly. But for the 12-year-old, in fact, after everything has happened, we talk about it on a regular basis, and she sees that some students would make certain comments in school. So back then, when during my school years, people would say "ching chong" or some other or slant-eyed or something, making those kind of comments. Nowadays, one day my daughter came back and said they started calling people using chink. My niece, who's 6 years older than my daughter, they were both saying, they said that's common. And I was very shocked because I'm thinking, wait a minute, we have our community, our society has progressed into such diversity where there's such an influx of Asian Americans. Surely those words are no longer repeated anymore. And oddly enough, I was shocked to hear that they use the words chink and the various Asian derogatory words. And so I asked my daughter as well as my niece, well, how do you all handle it? They said, well, sometimes they just kind of brush it off. They don't get confrontational, but luckily their friends would say things to those individuals making comments. But in reality, to diffuse the situation rather than being confrontational, what they would do is sometimes kind of just laugh it off like they're jokingly. But if it gets escalated to the next level, luckily their circle of friends are there to help. And that's important, which goes to what I was saying earlier, is that we need to band together regardless of what ethnic group, because the only way to fight hate of any type is with love. And that closeness, that bond of various ethnic groups bonding together is what's going to diffuse that hate and anger that exists out there.
Thank you, Kathy. All
Part
right.
of the challenge on some of this is you think about what Kathy just said. We think about what Sharyl was saying about Baylor students. Part of the challenge is exactly the solidarity and coalitional life that Kathy is pushing us towards. That there's something about race that introduces a kind of competition among the races. That's what race was created for. It's a divide and conquer strategy. We need to remember that race isn't an actual essential quality about persons. It's a political economic ploy to divide people, right? Race was created to separate white working class people from black working class people, indentured from enslaved people. There's something necessary and natural, central to race as a category to say, well, these people matter more than these other people. That's what race is. Race is not a biological category. It's not about difference. It's about differentiation. It's not about diversity. It's about stratification. We need to always remember that. Part of what's happened to some of the students that Sharyl talked about was they went and told people what happened to them. And sometimes what they heard was something like this: what happened to you is awful, but this is the summer for Black Lives Matters, right? And so in the context of that, what happened to you matters slightly less. And we need to think about the grammar of that kind of claim, because it's not only horrible, but it's extremely common. The racism that happens to my children somehow matters less than the racism that happens to African-American children. Whereas we might just simply want to say, and I think this is what Kathy was saying, is that they're both horrible. And yet we can't keep both on the radar as if they both matter. That the part of the problem in our society right now is that the way that race works is it introduces a necessary divisional reality within people. That's what happens when we forget that racism is not a natural category of who we are as people. It's introduced for the sake of division. As long as we continue to think in racial terms, we will think in competitive terms. If you want to see a really powerful articulation of this, look at Heather McGhee's most recent book, The Sum of Us, right? Miss McGhee basically says, why did white people close the pools when they're desegregated in the 1950s by the federal government, the federal courts? Why would they rather close the pools than share them with the Black people? Because it is part of the white racial mindset to think giving anything to Black people is to take something away from white people. It's the same logic nowadays, right? The logic that we have to give any attention to Asian Americans is to take away attention, say, from other minoritized racial groups. That's the kind of stuff that we need to work our way out of. If we don't, then even in our most powerful articulations of anti-racism, some people simply won't count. The reality for Asian Americans and Latinx people is it's a double erasure. The primary initial act of violence and racism, and then the second part that says, well, but that doesn't really count. We need to look at how both frameworks work to look at how racism works generally in the United States.
And just to keep going with that, Jonathan, as the white person on the panel, we'll just keep moving with that, is that generally speaking, whiteness and that its construct cannot handle deconstructing more than one thing at once because it needs categories to stay in control and it needs categories to make things work, and power needs categories to make anything work. And so as a mother of biracial children, it has become increasingly difficult for kids who want to know who they are because other people want to know what they are and want to know where they fit. And as you know, multiracial children are on the, you know, that category is on the rise in the US.
Right. So to me, the question isn't like, you know, my kids are the only Asian American kids at one of their schools, Rappaport, which is a small school, and the other one's at a massive school, and she's still the only Asian American. And there may be one or two. The question isn't whether they experience racism on a regular basis. The question is why, given how much they do, is that not seen? Why does it matter less in our collective anti-racist imagination? The conversation to me at this point isn't with racists. I'm not interested in having moral conversations with racists. The conversation we need to have is why does anti-racism operate in this country as if Black and white people are the only people that exist in this country? We absolutely need to give more attention to anti-Blackness and the way it is absolutely structured into our society in a way that conspires consistently, persistently, overwhelmingly against Black life. But attending to that doesn't mean that we somehow need to diminish our capacities to pay attention to what's happening on the southern border, right? Why is this is a feature of racism that delimits our imaginative capacity to take in the reality of the world. That's what we need to fight against. The big fight for me isn't with racists. Clearly they have something wrong going on. The question is what's happening with our anti-racism, that it cannot see these things that happen right in front of it. That's the difficult and really painful question to me.
But for good, nice white people, if we can just keep it about the racists, then we don't have to do anything.
That's right. And that's the convenience, right? To say it's just about bad ideas, or we need to correct people's knowledge about, say, people with accents, et cetera, et cetera. That's the easy, convenient way of dealing with this. The much harder question is, how is this baked into our society, right? How's our housing set up to conspire against Black mortgages, to push Black people out of Black communities? Those are the much more difficult questions, much easier to focus on the prototypical racists out there. Much harder to think what's happening with our anti-racist discourse, that they consistently miss the marginalization of whole groups of people.
Yeah, I just went and did a pre-qualification on a house of thinking about building and went and put Cheryl West and did all of that by myself because that's a privilege that I have and can do, because that's the discrimination in housing. This did the same thing buying a car.
Did you feel that you would have had maybe less success if you had had your husband with you?
Oh, I know that. I've seen it.
And you've had that experience here before?
Mm-hmm.
I know, speaking to many candidates who of Asian descent, says, wow, what name would you run under? Do you run under your main name, which is Asian, or do you run under your spouse's name, which is Caucasian? And 10 out of 10 picked Caucasian, because the reality is when you look at the elected official positions, majority of the elected officials are either Caucasian. Like in my Supreme Court cases, how many Asian American elected officials on the Supreme Court? 0. How many on the statewide position? 0. So to some of the colleagues, they kind of joked and say, maybe you should you should look for a husband with a Caucasian name. That's unfortunate, but that's a reality what's out there, that our mindset, what we're so used to seeing the majority, so therefore the majority rules, and that would set the tone of what we need to do. So that's it gets played at all levels, not just in the mortgage, not just in the school system, but across the board. But we just don't seem to see it that way because, like Dr. Transit, it's out of convenience.
Yeah, I cannot imagine the amount of abuse Kathy must have gotten by putting herself out like that, right? I mean, one of the things that'll be really helpful for your listeners is that there's a concept out there for how Asian Americans are imagined. And this goes with what she said earlier about complaining, right? We're understood as the model minorities. That is, we're models because we're more successful than everyone else. We go to college more than everyone else. We have higher income averages than everyone else. That's just fundamentally untrue, right? That's true for a very small percentage of Asian Americans. But, Sheryl's husband is Cambodian. Cambodians as a group have some of the highest rates of poverty, lowest rates of high school graduation in the country. But if everyone thinks that what Asian Americans are crazy rich Asians, then that gets forgotten. But the other thing that makes Asians, quote, models is that we succeed, we experience racism, and that supposedly we don't complain, right? The first people that coined this phrase in the 1960s did it intentionally to set successful Japanese Americans against who? African Americans who are protesting for their rights. The idea was to really be a model in America, a minority in America, is to succeed, suffer your racism, and never complain about it. So that once you have that picture of that's what it means to be successful, that's disciplining not only Asian Americans, think about what it does to the mindset of an African American, right? To say that's how you should be. So we perpetually live under these myths, these stereotypes that have, as Jaja is really powerfully talking about, just the consistent pressurized trauma on our minds about what it means to be Asian Americans. And then you even then begin to think about, like, if the stereotype is what it means to be Asian Americans, what types of injustices are Asian Americans willing to commit to live up to it, right? It's what sociologists call the opportunity hoarding in certain forms of education. The way certain Asian American businesses, right, profit off of by exploiting local African American communities. These are hard things to talk about within our community. We're often not honest about it, but this is the pressurized reality of living under these stereotypes as a perpetual way of understanding our lives in the country.
Someone had asked a second ago as you were talking, what the racial profile of the bully, what was the racial profile of the bullies? And I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Difficult question, as you can imagine, right? Because on the one hand, in the most high profile, you think about the camera and the New York incident, the San Francisco incident, we've seen a lot of African Americans depicted as doing violence, but who knows what to trust in terms of what the media portrays. The media is obsessed with the idea of the violent African American. So you're not sure what to do with those images. The reality is, what, according to the Stop AAP I Hate, is the vast majority are white people. But for some reason, the media fixates on the image of the Black person committing crimes against Asian Americans, right? Which is probably not representative of the reality, but it's also not representative of the complex nature of Asian American and say, African American Latinx communities. I mean, we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of the LA, quote, riots, the LA rebellion, as some people call it, which was poor, right, Blacks, poor Mexican folks, and poor Asian Americans fighting for scraps at the end of the table in a gentrified city where they're pitted against each other. And so these are extraordinarily complex realities, and we need more sophisticated conceptual lenses, including honest conversations within our communities, and as Kathy has been really pushing rightly, between our communities. And until we're willing to have that, our forms of solidarity and coalition will be anemic. They'll be as thin as can be. Until we're willing to have honest conversations about what it means to be racialized against each other, right, then we're really never going to make a step forward in anti-racism. I mean, that book, Heather McGee, she has a wonderful line. She says, the sum of us, the SUM, will get far more done than the SOME, the few of us. But the few of us tends to be how we think about these questions. What we need to get, and this is what Kathy's been saying, we need to get to the sum of us, the SUM. Until all of us are seen, my thought is none of us are going to be seen.
Thank you. Jaja, I've seen you nodding. Do you have, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any comments on any of that? You've been.
Yeah. I think it's just interesting what Dr. Tran was saying, because I've been participating in some online Facebook groups throughout this pandemic, and one of them was a therapist or clinicians of color Facebook group, and another was a Black and Asian Americans Facebook group. And it's really interesting how in the past year, even just the debate of who is a person of color has sparked a lot of controversy, if you will, on these forums, where even a lot of clinicians were saying that Asian Americans were not counting as people of color within the clinicians of color group, right? And so yeah, I think it goes back to what Dr. Tran was talking about, in the sense of that the racialized society, or whiteness is ending, it's gonna always lead to the pitting of the minorities against minorities, and then it ends up being where, we can lose the momentum or lose sight of what are we actually fighting against in the end, right? But I think it also is important for us to acknowledge, the ways that our own people can be racist and have racialized views against other minorities. And we need to reckon with that within our own communities. Another thought I had was to the question that one of the participants had posed. They asked, typically speaking up about mental health is considered taboo within certain Asian communities. With your background in therapy and social work, what is your reaction to the rise or influx in Asian American clients? I think for me, seeing that the rise of Asian American clients has been really exciting for me. Of course, I'm coming from the therapist perspective to see just the courage it takes for so many individuals to, most of the time, they're the first, individual in their whole family to have ever spoken out or to reach out for therapy. And so this idea of, that it took them to get to that point of realizing, they want to unlearn all these things that we're talking about here, and even to work through just all the generations of trauma that they've experienced. I think I'm just humbled in my work to see the work that clients do, because, many of them want to do this work because of them being parents, right? And wanting to raise Asian American kiddos, with the health and with the understanding of how to better work through who they are in their identities and as they get older. So I think, this idea of Asian Americans being silent, or even this idea of not pursuing mental health, is going to start to really chip away or even start to decline in the next couple of years, because more and more Asian Americans are getting help and reaching out and speaking up. And what that means is there's going to be a lot more empowerment within our own community, and empowerment for people to become leaders or to run for political office or to start businesses or to, pursue different goals of getting involved. So that makes me really excited, when it comes to the ways of how our community healing is going to lead to, further growth and change, and even just further involvements in our community.
Thank you, Jaja. Kathy, you wanted to say something.
Yes. I just want to touch a little bit about the therapy with respect to the children, since I handle a lot of family law cases, and a lot of them involve children. So the question was posed about the Asian Americans going to therapy and so forth. So there's a huge stigma about therapy for the Asian American population, because it deals with the mental aspect, emotional aspect. So somehow you're labeled as crazy, which is not. So in these divorce cases involving children, a lot of the children involved needs therapy because they can't understand why the parents are going through a divorce. And I have to explain to my clients that therapy is a good thing. Don't let that community stigma label prevent the child from going to therapy. Because if you picture this, think of a paper bag, and every stress factor we encounter, we put a marble into that paper bag. If you continue to take that stress factor, so for these children, the divorce or school trauma or bullying or anything, you put one marble into that paper bag. Over time, what happens to that paper bag? The paper bag will pop. So one way to prevent that paper bag from popping is to dispose of the marbles, like taking the trash out. So imagine that paper bags is the equivalent of us as human beings. So if your children or you yourself are experiencing these daily stress factors, and you don't share and unload these marbles at one point or the other, it creates a meltdown, which in certain circumstances, sometimes with these hate crimes, is the result of a meltdown. Therefore, you seek out a certain ethnic group. So I hope that the general population listening to this, when you hear this, let us not go into this future labeling therapy as a mental condition or a cuckoo craziness, as what people think, but as a way of taking out the trash and starting fresh, so that our mind, our body can continue to deal with the things that we must deal with in society. Because when you're talking about family cases, or even the situation that we're all dealing with right now, it is stressful. There is nothing more stressful than for a child who is going through divorce and having to deal with the increased American Asian racism that's occurring. And so, if anything, let everybody know, let's think of therapy as a good thing. So know to seek out for help before it gets to the meltdown situation.
Thank you, Kathy. Anybody want to comment on that before we go on?
I did want to say one more thing, is that I've suspected that part of why mental health treatment might also be more stigmatized is the fact that there really is not that many therapists or clinicians who are Asian American, right? Or even Asian background, or I mean, for that matter, just clinicians of color in general. It's a very low percentage in our nation here. And so I think just the access is huge, and even just having someone who looks like you or who understands your culture. So I think it's very important for us to also see it that way, because instead of just blaming it on the community for not accessing help, to also really examine, okay, do we actually even have providers who look like the communities that we're trying to serve? Are we supporting students, to be able to become therapists? Are we providing access and opportunities for jobs, when it comes to clinicians of color, and even just access to affordable mental health services, right? All of these are so many of the systemic issues that Dr. Tran was talking about earlier that can lead to the systemic racism that prevents resources towards people of color.
I had a question that just came in a little while ago, and it says, how can, and I this may go to the two Baylor people, but anyone, and I want to just touch on this briefly because I want to make sure we go to some other areas before we're gone here. And it says, how can we call for educational institutions to be better racially conscious as it serves diverse students while avoiding fixation on racial division, but also color blindness? That's how they worded it. Any thoughts from the Baylor people, particularly, since you work at an institution of higher education?
To me, this is one of the $1 million questions, not
Mhm.
only per educational institutions, but in America in general. So if we think race is a construct for domination, do we get rid of race? Right. And that's how color blindness, racialism, people have talked about it. That's not at all what I would suggest. Abraham Kendi, in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist, has this really wonderful, sad line where he says, it's one of the tragedies of racism that we need to keep racism on the table to track its disparities and its injustices and its harms. How do we do that without re-essentializing people? That is a huge question. I mean, think about the term Asian American. How can it be descriptively accurate when Asia is a massive set of realities? Tons of different countries, experiences, economies, religions, languages, ethnicities. So it can't possibly be accurately, descriptively accurate. And yet that's put on top of us as if it describes something. So how do we recognize the absurdity of race categories, the violence, the history, right, without re-essentializing them, but also trying to keep track of the damage of racialization? That is a $1 million question. And I think one of the most difficult questions for anti-racists going forward will be this question. How important, how much do we keep on the fore racial identity when racial identity is an imposition of domination? How do we think about this question? And I have to admit, I don't quite know. Because if we think about it, let's say we have an ethnic studies class and we say, here's what Asian Americans are, they're X, Y, and Z. What do we do for every Asian American that doesn't fit X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, think about the reality that there are more African Americans in America than there are Canadians in Canada, that there is greater genetic diversity in the continent of Africa than there is everywhere else in the world. So these are not essential qualities. So how do we both teach people about, say, my experience, Jaja's experience, without re-essentializing race all over again? And I'm not sure how we answer this question. This is, to me, the $1 million question for anti-racism going forward.
Well, if we're going to try to answer the $1 million question, does anybody else want to jump in on that $1 million question?
Yeah, I would say that first answering the $1 million question is setting up the very gray area that was just set up, is that you don't start with one simple answer, and that understanding that, for one, talking about ethnicity as key, as instead of just race, would be really helpful. That there's more than 20 countries that we would be talking about when we talk about Asian American, and then how many cultures and how many languages, and how could we possibly, ask students, if we're speaking in educational context, to live in that hyphen when it's people in power who tend to be from a dominant culture that tends to be white, who are defining what it means to be Asian American. That's not a good starting place. So there's a really great book that came out last May called The Inner Work of Racial Justice by Rhonda V. McGee. And it's really works from a mindfulness perspective, and that I would recommend in terms of considering for not just people from the majority by any means. She's an African-American scholar, she's legal scholar actually, but what it means to come into a room and start to take note of, am I the only one that looks like me? Does everyone look like me? Simple things like that. And so I think that maybe beginning to train like framing of our minds to what it's like to be who we are in our context is helpful. It's not the only thing. I think the other thing that I would say on this is complete audits of what do we read, what do we teach, what do we consider normalized, and then story sharing, and what is the story that we're sharing and why. And those are, I mean, you're talking about unpacking and redoing huge structures, but there's certainly a concept, and this is at K through 12 levels. I mean, we're seeing it right now with the critical race theory being outlawed. There's certainly a power grab for what is the dominant narrative that wants to be taught. And we're going to have to figure out, are we going to let that be, or are we going to tell multiple stories from multiple streams? So
We've got another question that came in a moment ago, and this is very timely. It says that the Texas legislature is arguing that if critical race theory is forbidden, Texas students will move to greater peace. Does the Texas educational system work against a conversation about racism? This is very timely since that just happened in the Texas legislature. So do any of you, especially Kathy, since you did run for office, have any comments on that?
There's no doubt racism occurs and exists in this world, based on this panelist and what has happened around this country and around the world. I think one solution, would be the solution is that if it's not about implementing anything, but to alter each individual human being's thought process. And that is, we as human beings, the human race is composed of various race ethnic groups. And if we compare that to the human body is made of many parts. You have the arms, you have the organs, you have the brain and everything. Not one less important than the other, but the human body functions the way it should be, collectively, with all the parts as one. We as the human beings, the human race, have these various parts just like the human body. And that's the white group, the Asian group, the Latino group, and the African-American group. Where not one group is better or less than the other. When we start altering the mindset of each individual that way, that transformation can occur. And that's when we do away with any type of racism, any type of hate against anyone, without even having to implement anything. No walls, nothing.
When the Southern Baptist Convention, just like the Texas legislature, came out with a broad sweeping dismissal of critical race theory, I thought, these people either don't know what critical race theory is, which is likely, or they don't really care about racism. If racism is as titanic a problem as it is, we should look for every possible tool in the toolbox to tackle it. Are there parts of critical race theory that are not great? Of course, that's true of any intellectual discourse in the world. But it doesn't mean we dismiss it out of hand, because if we're serious about the problems confronting us, we'll look for available lights anywhere we can get them. So it's just fundamentally absurd and anti-intellectual to say we dismiss this out of hand. What it sounds like to me is some people are scared of the truth. And they don't want, the problem is you live in self-denial long enough, you will be broken over those lies. Wendell Berry had a great line in his book, The Hidden Wound. Wendell Berry says the problem with white people who deny the history of slavery and racism is they bear that wound in their soul, because they have to do two things. They have to continue to perpetuate racism, and they have to continue to hold up the lie that they don't. That is an unbearable moral burden that human beings are not supposed to carry around. Why not, as part of our Christian confession that begins with confession, say, hey, you know what? I need Jesus because I'm a sinner. Part of that sin is the sin I've committed against other people. That seems like a much simpler thing than to enact structures upon structures of self-denial, which is what people do when they say, I don't want the 1619 Project, I don't want critical race theory. Critical race theory is just, let's think critically about the problems in front of us and let's use the tools we have. That doesn't mean we accept everything, but it does mean we take a hard, serious look at the world around us.
By admitting that one race was wrong, then that means that the race of majority that was in control would be showing to be weak.
Exactly. That's why they don't want critical race theory. They don't want to have to admit. Right? I mean, who wants to admit that the world that we live in was given to us because of certain advantages given to certain racialized communities? No one wants to do that, right? But that's where I actually think Christianity has something to offer us. Christianity starts with the fundamental idea that I'm a needy, dependent person, and that's okay, right? That I'm not supposed to be strong and perfect, that it's okay to be a needy person. That's what cross and resurrection do. I mean, the thing that we can't forget as Christians is that God can handle our sins. That's what cross and resurrection is. What God cannot handle is our justification for our sins, because at that moment we say, I don't need God. right? So that's where I think Christianity actually can do some work for us. As complicit as Christianity has been in racism, it actually still has unbelievably powerful resources for us in this. And accepting what Kathy just said, just to accept, hey, the country started off in a pretty poor place and there's long-term consequences. It seems to me, why is that so hard to wrap our mind around? But it's what Kathy said, to admit that, to admit the 1619, what the 1619 Project people are doing, to commit to the insights of saying some of the best stuff in critical race theory, is to acknowledge some things about ourselves that it's too hard for us to come to terms with.
Which, with as many Christian churches as we have in Texas, it seems like we could make this all work out very beautifully. We just confess our sins in all of our churches, and critical race theory can live on in the hearts of our schools. And
hey, Cheryl and I go to a great church with a great set of pastors that help us to confront this stuff all the time. And it's part of the grammar of Christianity to do so. It's not like un-Christian to do that. It's just part of what we do. And that's one of the things I'm really grateful. And, it's a church full of white people and they're working out their, white complicity. And it's a beautiful, powerful thing. Is it everything? No, but it's something.
It's interesting. The question that was being posed was, does the Texas educational system work against a conversation about racism? My thought with the legislation was that, it's not only working against the conversation about racism, but it's even just shutting down civic engagement in general, which ultimately negatively impacts white people as well. Because I believe the legislation even prevents service projects or civic engagement to count towards credit for students. And so it's just interesting how people are not even thinking about okay, this is not just anti-intellectual or against racism, but it's also preventing white people themselves from being more engaged and attuned into civic duties and engagements and volunteering work.
So let me just address this with the legislature, right?
Shortly, quickly.
When you look at the number of legislatures in office and you look at who's in the majority, and these are the individuals making the rules, so you kind of think how equal and how would it impact everybody? So that's when you got to think, this is why we need to get involved and instead of having monochromatic panel or elected officials, we need that diversity in there so that whenever laws are made, we don't have to sit here and go, do you think that's playing favoritism towards one group or disfavoring one the other? That's the problem. That's the whole thing. When we start dissecting what's undermining the whole process, what causes racism, it's who's in control and how do we get that control to see a different perspective. If you have integration of different ethnic groups, different races coming together, making the laws, enforcing the laws, being part of the educational process, talking about what we're just talking about, sharing, then we would have a better way of dealing with this instead of having the easier way, as Cheryl said earlier. It's easy, just not confronting it. Let's just pretend like nothing happened. Be in denial constantly.
We're going to have to cut it at that spot. I could go on. I think we could discuss this for a very long time. For the audience, several of you have sent messages. Will this be taped somewhere? Yes, we are taping this. It's going to be on our website, and give it a few days and then go on and they'll have a link to the YouTube, our YouTube, I don't want to say page, but our YouTube area, and it will be available. I want to thank all four of our panelists. I think it takes a lot of bravery to come and put your thoughts out there for a bunch of strangers to listen to and to ask you questions. So our heartfelt thank you from the Community Race Relations Coalition to all of you. If you want to know more about our organization, go to our website, and anything else we're having will be there. And in the meantime, I want to thank all of you. And this is the first step to making everything move forward and to find a more beloved community. And we will say good night then. And thank you all.